This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Lord Frost, former chief Brexit negotiator, on Keir Starmer's Brexit betrayal and his deal with the EU, and whether the Tory Party is on its last legs.
I mean, it seems to me the real problem the party's got is, what's the USP? What's the selling point? What do you get by voting Conservative? I struggle to see, without a really significant change, how it's going to dig itself out of this.
James Price, political commentator and former senior special advisor, on everything that's wrong with the British state and how to fix it.
I think you've got to have basically legislation on a whole host of things drafted and ready to be implemented on day one. I think you've got to probably, I'm afraid, fire a load of senior civil servants. If you're going to go for a snake, you make sure you kill it, right? Or leave it alone. Because if you wound it, that thing is going to come back for you.
And for our premium subscribers, I catch up with David Shipley, writer on prisons and justice, on Lucy Connolly's cruelly rejected appeal over her draconian 31-month sentence for a tweet.
And yeah, I think it's a bit gross. Like, it just feels like she and other people who've committed these, speech offences are being targeted in a very destructive and very vindictive way by a state that is less and less tolerant of dissent as its moral legitimacy becomes less and less.
Well, it's been Keir Starmer's Brexit reset this week, but is it the sellout summit? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by David Frost, Lord Frost of Allenton, who's a former diplomat and was, of course, the chief Brexit negotiator under Boris Johnson, and who's a Conservative peer now, and a Telegraph columnist. Welcome back to The Sceptic, David.
Great to be back.
Yeah, very good to have you here. Now, of course, you've got real experience in this particular domain of negotiating the Brexit and with the EU in general. And so before we get into this deal this week, I suppose, what were the key lessons you learned as chief Brexit negotiator over those years that perhaps Starmer should now be applying?
Yeah, so I think he's made several of the errors that the Theresa May team made and that British negotiators often do make. One, things you really should be clear about are what you want from the deal, what you're trying to achieve, what you're prepared to concede to get it, and to make sure that you always have a walk-away option, that there's a credible no deal that they believe you might exercise. And if you don't have those things in place, then you're doing what British negotiators often do, which is to have some vague ideas and kind of go in and say, well, let's see what we get. Let's see how far it goes. And then you get taken to the cleaners by the EU, who've been doing this for years and years. It's very obvious that Starmer didn't have a walk-away option. He'd set the date of the summit long before the negotiations were concluded. He had to get an agreement or his policy would come apart. The EU spotted that and he chucked a load of concessions out of the boat at the last minute, and that's why we got the sellout.
So, of course, that deal flows from what you negotiated back in 2020 and with everything related to that. Remind us, I suppose, of the shape of that agreement and what is now changing.
Yeah, so what we did in 2020 was the trade deal, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, as it's called, which is a normal but extremely broad and deep free trade agreement, like lots of countries have with each other around the world. And it covers lots of things other than trade. It covers security cooperation. It covers the health card, for example, that you get when you go to the EU. That's a product of this treaty. Lorries, aviation, fisheries, all these kind of things are in it. But it's a standard free trade agreement, reduces tariffs to zero. And as far as I could see, that agreement, after a few teething troubles in the first month or two, had been working pretty well. And that's what you would expect, because these are normal around the world. It's not obvious to me that any sort of reset was needed. There are always things you can kind of smooth off the edges. One or two things we asked for we didn't get. One or two things we didn't concede to the EU. But basically it was working perfectly well. The problem is that Starmer and Labour, being where they are on the EU, persuaded themselves that this was not working well, that it was a bad deal, that it needed improving. They got into the reset negotiations and they found that the only way you could improve it, in their terms, was to give away lots of control and drift back into the single market. And so that's exactly what's happened. So what they've done is based on a kind of fundamental a misassessment of what the 2020 deal was all about. If there is something we'd like to have improved, of course, it was the withdrawal agreement, where most of the work had been done by Theresa May before we came in. And it includes the rather difficult and unsatisfactory Northern Ireland Protocol. That's what we should have been trying to work and negotiate away, but apparently Labour's quite happy with it.
And so in terms of Labour's mindset here, I know you wrote a fantastic essay at the weekend for The Telegraph about how really this is the culmination of Labour's 10-year attempt to frustrate or even betray Brexit. Of course, they were, campaigning for a second referendum and were very much against Brexit at the time of the first one. I suppose put this in context for us. It's not just tinkering with the trade deal. It's really they would rather that we actually be back in the bloc as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they would. We know that, they know that. They have to pretend they don't for wider political reasons. They committed in the manifesto not to. But everything about their behaviour, what they did in, as you say, the Brexit years, shows they do want to. And unfortunately, that is not limited to the Labour Party. A lot of the British establishment wanted to stay in the EU, and if they couldn't, they wanted to stay as close to it as they could. They didn't really believe Britain could govern itself as a normal, free country. And at every step of the way, they fought to keep us closely aligned to the bloc. That was Theresa May's plan. We scuppered it, put us into a normal, free democracy situation, apart from Northern Ireland issue. Unfortunately, since then, we've been drifting back. First of all, under Rishi Sunak accepting the Northern Ireland Agreement definitively, and now going back into elements of the single market for food, for energy, and so on under Starmer. So they're getting back to where much of the British establishment is really comfortable that this country should be, which is in the tractor beam of the EU, not governing itself properly, not forging its own way. And I don't think that's what people voted for.
And so, I mean, you mentioned at the start them not really having that clarity of what they wanted in terms of negotiations, and partly that was, why they've not had a great deal this time. But is it also a function of the fact that really they'd like to be closer to the EU anyway, so they're not really minded to negotiate robustly?
That's right. That's exactly right. The purpose of this negotiation was to get closer to the EU, and they didn't really care what price they paid. They've got in this sort of ridiculous position of claiming that concessions, what are actually concessions, are really benefits to the UK, and they've been able to do that because they really don't care about what they give away. They've got a very, very weak defence agreement. I mean, I'm glad that it's weak because I don't want to replace NATO with EU arrangements. But really, it's so weak, it's about just showing up to meetings mainly. So why would you concede lots and lots of serious stuff about your right to control your own affairs unless your purpose is just, we don't care, we just want to get closer to the EU, we don't really mind what the price is. And that was their approach. The EU could obviously see that, and that's why they got forced into making lots of concessions at the very last moment, the 12 years on fisheries, which I'm sure we'll talk about. That was a bounce in the last sort of 36 hours of the process, and they didn't see it coming. The EU took them to the cleaners.
Yeah, I mean, tell us a bit more about that. I know you feel strongly about that, but essentially we had been about to get our sovereignty back, and now we're not. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, our deal made this country an proper independent coastal state, in the jargon, again, like every other country that has fishing grounds, able to control the environment, able to license boats and so on. What we agreed was a 5.5-year transition period in terms of quotas. Our quotas that we could fish in UK waters went up by 25%, and that was stable for 5.5 years. After that, i.e. in a year's time, everything went back completely to normal. We had full rights. We could exclude EU ships if we wanted. We had a normal quota negotiation like every other country in the world does. Now, what Starmer's deal has done is push all that off for another 12 years, which really is a very long time. I mean, it's a couple of investment cycles for a business. It makes it really not worth investing because they've been told they can't increase the size of the market. They can't increase the size of the catch for another 12 years. And Starmer is trying to claim this is just an extension of our agreement. So what is the problem? But obviously the point of our transition was that it ended, and he's just extended it. I mean, my analogy is if you get divorced and you agree to sort of smooth the transition to pay your spouse for 5 years, and then at the end of that 5 years they say, you're going to have to pay for another 12, and claim that shouldn't be a problem for you because it's only the amount you agreed originally. So why would you have a problem? Obviously, it's a completely different situation, and that's what he's generated with fisheries. It's a completely different situation, and it's going to be extremely difficult for our industry now.
So yeah, fisheries has been a big point of concern and criticism. What are some other parts of the bill that you're not necessarily happy with?
Well, the big two concessions that are worked up in the paperwork. There are others, but the big two are rejoining the single market for agri-food, SPS goods in the jargon. They try to avoid the word single market because the manifesto says we're not rejoining the single market, but it definitely is the single market for agri-food because the EU is setting the laws. We have to accept them. They operate in this country whether we like it or not. We can't import foods that don't meet EU standards even if we want to. We have to apply EU standards here. Even if you're not exporting to the EU, you've still got to apply them. So that is what single market is, and that's what we have signed up to. The other big area is energy, where they've gone further even than I thought. I must say. Clear commitment to join the single electricity market in the EU, again, despite the manifesto commitment. They're going to join the carbon emissions trading scheme. We have a separate one. Our carbon price is about 2/3, 60% of the EU's price. So joining that is going to push up costs even further. We in future will have no say over the goods that it's going to apply to, and the EU scheme will apply to fuels, to petrol from 2027. So you can see a petrol price increase coming in as well. All of this without any say. That's the crucial thing. We get the right to express a view to the EU. They don't have to take any notice of it. And I've been in these discussions where third countries express a view and nobody pays any attention to it whatsoever. So we've sold away really important rights of self-government that are going to drive up costs in return for what? This thin defence agreement and a couple of other cosmetic advantages that aren't even real advantages.
Yes, and we'll discuss those in a second, whether they are. But just on how that alignment will take place or not. I mean, so there's going to be arbitration panels, I understand, and this is billed as, well, they're going to be independent, so it will be fair. But it seems that they actually, if there's any disputes over whether they are being fair, it will go to the European Court of Justice. So, I mean, that's not sovereignty, is it?
That's right. It's completely cosmetic. They tried this on us in 2020. In the trade agreement, and we rejected it entirely. And indeed, we wrote into the trade agreement that a provision that says there's nothing in this agreement that is EU law, just to make sure that there was never any way of the courts getting into the processes. Now, I mean, we've accepted EU law in agri-food. That's what this is going to do. Therefore, if there's a dispute about the terms, it's a dispute about EU law. And the agreement says that the European Court has the final say on interpreting EU law. So it's entirely cosmetic. The arbitration panel will have to refer all the substantive points to the European Court, and they will have to do whatever the European Court tells them. So it's entirely a facade to the reality, which is EU law and court control.
And of course, we know that there's almost an ideological disposition towards international courts and international law in the Labour Party, as obviously represented in particular by Starmer, but also his ally Lord Hermer. But does it represent, I suppose, is it naivety there, or is it just, why do they not realise that simply because it calls itself independent and a court, that actually, I mean, if people who know a lot about the EU know that the ECJ is not really that independent and actually can make some quite political and activist rulings.
Absolutely. It's an extremely political court. I mean, even more political than the ECHR court has come to be over the years. It's a court that its explicit purpose is to foster European integration and the purpose of the treaties. So, people, countries like us are always on the back foot in cases of the ECJ for exactly that reason. And, I think, some of it is kind of naivety on the British side over the years. They don't quite realise what they're getting into. Some of it is, there's a kind of political, bureaucratic, legal kind of class that, crosses borders and feels more in common with each other than they do with the countries they've come from. And that's why, Lord Hermer doesn't feel as uneasy about the European courts as most people in the country feel. I do think it goes down to some of these kind of emotional issues as well as legal ones.
And so I appreciate this may be a difficult question, but are there any benefits to this deal? We had this idea of e-gates, that you wouldn't have to queue as much. Is that even true? And if so, is it worth it for everything else?
I mean, it's a very small concession. We obviously did try to get this in 2020, and when we failed, we opened our e-gates to the Europeans anyway. We were told that this was up to member states, and it couldn't go in the treaty because it was up to member states. And that, in fact, is what Starmer has been told again in 2025. That's what the actual agreement says. It hasn't got a commitment to open all e-gates. It's still going to be up to member states when they operate the new system. And the truth is, some countries do allow it already. I mean, I've been through e-gates in Portugal and Spain and Italy, and others have been through them elsewhere. So this really is not a victory. It's dressing up of what is basically the status quo because he thinks it's going to land well. And I mean, it's incredible, really, that Labour thinks we're stupid enough to believe this stuff. And, his deal is beginning to come apart as people look at the detail of what it actually means. The other big benefit, at least that's what Labour say, is this defence agreement. But as I say, it is really about just attending foreign policy and defence meetings and being invited to collaborate with the EU in various areas. Well, they gain more from that than we do in most areas. We've got the big foreign policy apparatus. We've got the big defence apparatus. We've got big defence industries. Really, that should be something we were offering to get something back, not something that we wanted and were prepared to make concessions to give. It just shows that the whole thing has been conducted the wrong way around.
And yeah, I mean, I suppose on conducting things the wrong way around, is there something quite symbolic almost about this e-gates gesture? Because of course that's the key point of complaint that Remainers have made since Brexit, that it's been taken slightly longer to queue when you're going on a European holiday, and that's almost seems to be the constituency that Labour are playing to, and meanwhile they're selling out on the rather more important thing that in fact 17.4 million people did vote for, which is British sovereignty over everything.
Yes, I mean it's laughable, really. They seem to be motivated by a few sort of prominent journalists and people on X who post about this and complain about it, but actually I think I don't think those sort of people really care about e-gates as such at all. I think what they don't like is being relegated to what they see as kind of the outer tier, the people who are kind of visibly not European and are in a different queue. They don't like being relegated to that, and that's what really stings, I think, for this kind of Europeanized class of people. So what they really want is just to be part of the club again. That's what it's really all about. And if that's your attitude, you're always going to give things away.
So appeasing the EU beret wearers. Okay, so let's turn to some other. We had two other trade deals recently, which of course are part of the legacy of Brexit as well, in that we can now negotiate such things. So first of all, the one with India. What did you make of that? I think there's some measures in that which perhaps will benefit the economy a bit, but one of the key points of contention is this seemingly two-tier migration rule, basically, which meant that certain Indian workers working here for up to 3 years would not need to pay national insurance. And what have you made of that deal?
Yeah, I mean, it is really difficult to tell because as far as I can see, they haven't published any of the paperwork yet. I personally have got a decent idea because I've been involved in the India trade thing for years. Indeed, when we're still in the EU, I was involved in helping negotiate the EU's India deal, and a lot of the issues are similar. But I think a lot hinges on the detail, and we don't really know for sure what the detail is. I think the India deal is basically a good deal. You know, they've got some good tariff reductions, most of which were locked in when the Conservative Party was still doing the negotiation. And I think it's worth having. As far as I can see, what it does is stop Indian workers who transfer under the deal. Not every Indian worker, but only the small number who benefit from the terms, stops them paying national insurance twice. Now, that does make Indian workers more competitive, there's no doubt, because you've removed a cost from them. You can argue it is just making it fairer competition. I don't know. We don't really know the details. So I slightly reserve judgment, but overall, I think it's likely to be a deal that's worth having to get into the Indian market, which is going to grow. That's where growth is going to come from.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the fact that we can do it is a clear, regardless of how well that particular deal has been negotiated, that is a clear benefit of Brexit.
Absolutely. I mean, it's comical, really, to see how reluctant Labour spokesmen are to admit that, being able to negotiate a trade deal is a benefit of leaving the EU. You just can't do it when you're an EU member. I mean, that is one of the, basic fundamentals of the European Union, is that you don't have your own trade policy. It's given to the Commission. And I think they just look a bit silly trying to deny it, to be honest. It'd be better to acknowledge it and, claim a win.
And so the US deal then?
The US deal, I think, is different. It's a lot thinner. It's really an agreement, as far as I could see from what the White House and we have published. It's an agreement to kind of adjust some tariffs, reduce some of the Trump tariff peaks in a few goods, and meanwhile carry on negotiating to reduce further and get further into it. So it's a sort of first step. It's not really comparable with the Indian deal, which does lots and lots of things in quite a deep way. But again, I'm not against that. I think, reducing the tariffs is a good thing. Just because you can't do it for everything doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it for some things when you can get them. And, we obviously we're in a worse position than we were before Trump put on his tariffs back in February, March. But I mean, that's the real world. We're in a better position than we were before this deal was done, and that's the important thing. So again, I think, possibly we've the Conservative Party's got itself in a slightly unnecessarily defensive position. When after all, we always said one of the benefits, as you say, of leaving the EU is to do trade deals. Here are some trade deals, and I think basically we should be supporting them.
And so, okay, in terms of other legacies of Brexit then, of course, there's this term global Britain that we did hear a lot, and this partly meant trade deals. But it seems to also, of course, Brexit gave us more control over our border, and we brought in that points-based system from 2021, and it really relaxed a lot of things under Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, social care visas, other requirements to advertise jobs here first were scrapped, and many other things. And that resulted in what is now come to be known as the Boris wave of immigration, which was largely low-skilled. It was about 3 million people over 3 years, 3 cities the size of Birmingham. And so, well, what do you make of course, as we know, the Tories did very, very poorly at the last election. I'm in fact going to talk about some of their very low polling figures in a second. And this is seen as this great betrayal of Brexit. What do you make of that being tied to, I suppose that being the first thing that the Tories decided to do with those new Brexit freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously a catastrophic political and economic and social error to do it. And I think I've said before that, I think the actual error was not so much the initial decisions on visas and immigration in 2020 and early 2021, because we were in the middle of a sort of massive economic shock through COVID. But it was the failure to correct. And in 2021, in 2020, nobody knew how many people had left. The economy shrank by about a third in the first half of the year. There were obvious supply chain strains and all these other things. And so I think, I wasn't involved in the decisions, but my impression from sort of hearing people talking about it was a bit of nervousness not to make any of that inadvertently worse by being too tight. The problem was that as soon as it became obvious that people were flooding in, we should have tightened up much more quickly than we did. In fact, we did the reverse. We added more occupations to the shortage list. By then, we had a Prime Minister in Rishi Sunak who said, nobody really cares about legal migration. It's only illegal migration that's a problem. And he carried on and got more and more liberal. And that's really the problem. People do make mistakes. And the decisions in 20 and 21 were definitely a mistake. But I think the blame is those who didn't tighten up fast and allowed this to continue until almost the last moment of Conservative government. And now, it's a very serious social, economic problem that the British economy and a lot of its political class just seem hooked on high migration and very reluctant to control it in the way that's necessary. And we absolutely must in future. It's going to be very difficult for the Conservative Party to shake off that legacy, I fear, given those decisions.
Well, yes, and particularly there have been suggestions from some places that the way to get the Conservative Party out of their present woes is to bring back Boris Johnson. But to many people, that will seem like madness, given that he is the one who indeed has this term Boris wave attached to him and is sort of principally to blame for this. Surely that's not the right way to go.
I don't know what Boris is planning. Obviously, I do talk to him, but I don't know, whether he's planning a comeback or not. I think the problem for Boris is obviously going to be on that issue and on net zero. Politics on the right has just moved massively since he was in charge. And, I don't know whether, even if he is willing to kind of repudiate the past, his great thing was kind of authenticity and sort of, telling people, connecting with people. People felt they kind of knew what they were getting. And to suddenly say, I got it wrong and I no longer believe this stuff, it kind of weakens that aspect to it. So I don't know. I think it's a pity he's sort of not in public life, but I struggle really to see him coming back as a kind of, leading Conservative politician, I must admit.
Okay, and so to get more into those woes, this week we've had this YouGov poll which puts the Tories at fourth place, below the Lib Dems, 16% only in the polling. Lib Dems at 17, Labour 22, Reform at 29. And so, of course, 6 months or so into Kemi Badenoch's reign as Conservative leader, you, of course, backed Robert Jenrick, and there have been some whisperings that maybe she should go after the very poor performance at the local council elections, of course. Well, it's a big hole that they're in, the Conservatives. How do they dig themselves out of it? Yeah,
it's a real problem. It seems to me the real problem the party's got is, what's the USP? What's the selling point? What do you get by voting Conservative confidently that you won't get by supporting anybody else? And I don't know what the answer to that question is at the moment. If you're a strong Conservative, you want to control immigration, you want to, to get rid of net zero, you want to get taxes down, all this sort of thing. Well, you've got reform, and a lot of people have gone to reform. If you are a sort of social liberal, a bit less worried about taxation levels, a bit more worried about the environment and so on, well, you've got the Lib Dems. What exactly is the Conservatives' sort of proposition at the moment? And that is the strategic problem. The reform threat is, I think, much the bigger and much the more risky for the party. And I can't see how the party recovers without trying to get on to reform's turf in policy terms and trying to recapture those conservative principles. But honestly, I'm not sure that it can do it any longer. The wasted vote problem that reform had is diminishing fast and may have disappeared entirely by this time next year, the next round of elections. And I struggle to see, without a really significant change in energy and levels of expressing conservative principles and the policies that follow, how it's going to dig itself out of this. It could happen, but every day that passes, it gets more difficult.
Should bad not go?
Well, I'm not. I don't want to kind of call for a particular leader to stay or go, because I think it's not the core of the problem. The strategic problem would remain if Kemi wasn't leader. The next leader would still have to work out where they wanted to stand and still have to work out what they personally stood for. And I think that's the real problem. What I would like her to be doing, though I'm increasingly doubtful it's going to happen, is really expressing conservative principles, not just the odd day, but like every day out there, drumming home the messages, repudiating the past on most things. And, telling people on the left of the party, if you don't like this, if you can't get behind Brexit or controlling immigration or getting rid of the net zero targets, if you don't like that, leave the party, go somewhere else, because this isn't, what you want isn't what the Conservative Party stands for. And I think unless we take some of those difficult decisions, what the leadership says is just words. People increasingly sort of don't believe what Conservative politicians say. They say, you say this, but look at what you did. And unless you can convince people the party is different and that all those who, dragged us back into the social liberal centre have gone, then nobody's going to believe us in future. So it's going to be extremely difficult, but that's, I think, what needs to be done.
Okay, well, Lord Frost, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Is something rotten in the British state? Now, it will be a rare person that would say that Britain has been governed well in recent years. Typically, we lay that blame at the door of politicians, and fair enough. But still, as well as our few hundred elected MPs and ministers, the government is comprised of thousands and thousands of functionaries, civil servants, and the like. So if we're unhappy with the state of the country today, there's plenty of blame to go around. Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by political commentator, columnist for City AM, and a former senior special advisor, James Price. Welcome to The Sceptic, James.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, good to have you here. So we're here to talk really about state dysfunction today, I think, and partly you can blame political parties for this a bit, but also their inability to get it to do what they want it to do. And so obviously you've seen that a lot up close in your role as a senior advisor. So, tell us a bit about that. And in particular, what are some experiences that people would be quite surprised to hear?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. I think it's a really important conversation that we have, not least because some of the political parties who are in opposition at the moment need to be thinking very, very hard about this. Hopefully they are, and not just thinking, but then planning for what they would do. I've got some very strong ideas for what I would do if I were made Lord Protector for the day. But the situation on the ground as it is now is when Keir Starmer took office in July of 2024, how many people changed jobs inside government? 200 or so. Those were the 100 ministers, so Tory MPs who were also ministers running government departments, they were out, and 100 or so of their special advisors. That's the kind of role that I did. It's the kind of role people were probably most well known. Dominic Cummings is the kind of chief spad, which is a kind of bad example in some ways because as the chief of staff inside Number 10, he had a little bit more actual power. But most special advisors have absolutely no authority, no power, no executive power, I should say, imperium if you were in Rome, to do anything at all. You cannot boss around a civil servant. You cannot tell them to do anything. You cannot do doing that. You can commission bits of work to be done, and then you can sort of sit on the shoulder of your boss, like a sort of Grima worm tongue, and say, listen, boss, please don't do that. Like, I've read all the papers. They're lying to you again. Please do it this way around instead. This is what the people elected you to do, not this thing they want you and all your predecessors to do. That's the only power they've got. There were a couple of rare examples where Alistair Campbell and I think Jonathan Poland and Tony Blair had some executive power, and that required an order laid in council, which is a very rare thing. It's a bit like the American executive orders that President Trump has been using to govern by for a while, and his predecessors too. But, so just to get that into context again, 200 people, the only people across the whole of government who actually changed jobs. Compare that again to that American system where many, many, many thousands of people come in and out, and they have actual authority. Being political figures, they obviously also have skin in the game, right? They will sink or swim based on what they do. And America complains about its blob, but for us, the whole system is the blob, if you want to use that phrase, minus those 200 political appointments. And from that, you get the pool of members of parliament. And so, at best, it's like 350 or so, maybe 400 for Starmer right now to choose from to fill 100 ministerial slots. And then the 100 other people who are willing to work very long hours, have no job security and no actual authority, no literal authority. They might have, again, the Roman auctoritas to do this, but no ability to actually command a civil servant around. And that's it. And that is the entirety with which the political party that wins a general election is supposed to then go and govern the country. I just think this is completely mad. And this has been borne out by the experiences that I had. So I was a special advisor in 5 different roles, first to the leader of the House of Lords, through the Theresa May days and the Boris Johnson days, stayed on there, through the leadership contests and the general elections and the start of COVID and things like that. I left back into the private sector for a bit and came back into the Department for Education under a guy called Nadeem Zahawi, and then went with him through the Treasury and the Cabinet Office and the Tory Party Central Office, where you're sort of half a party official and half a Cabinet Office bad again there in short order. And so I've seen quite a lot of how the sausage is made. And I'm here to say that all of Dominic Cummings' criticisms of the blob, of the machine, all the rest of it, is completely right. And if anything, he's perhaps a bit soft. Now, this is a real, I think, constitutional problem. I think it's a philosophical problem that we've got. That power is not being wielded by those who have a democratic legitimacy to wield it. And it's why when one party leaves and another party comes in, nothing really actually changes. We've had that sense so much with the Labour Party coming in, right? Nothing seems to get better. And it's because, unlike in that American system, almost everybody is still the same, whether it's people who are trying to stop Rwanda, make Rwanda happen and now stopping Rwanda, whether it's on the economy, taxes going down, taxes coming up, although, of course, actually, I suppose taxes are only ever going up. It's the same people doing it. And the last thing I'll say on it is that they're the same people in all the way through, whether it's the civil service or the quangos or the regulators and all this stuff where power has been frittered out. Same kinds of people, often the same people themselves, because you don't ever actually leave a civil service job. You can only get paid more if you leave a civil service job into a different role. And that could be something completely different. It could be sewage one day, it could be foreign policy the next, it could be defence procurement after that. So you don't actually have a corpus of decent knowledge built up of expertise. And these are the same people, they never go into the private sector, they never go into any other walk of life, they just keep going up the cursus honorum, they keep going up the rungs. Unlike in that American system where you leave, you come back again in 4 or 8 years' time with a load more experience into a more senior role. That is, I think, at the heart of the problems that we've got in the country in terms of ever getting anything done. I think we're all starting to feel that now, and that lack of democratic accountability as both a pressure valve release and as a way to course correct.
Yeah, and just to illustrate that a bit more then, what's a particularly egregious example of the civil service really running rings around the minister and the elected will of the people that they're supposed to be representing?
Yeah, it's a good question. Couple of examples. I'll do some big ones and some small ones. Small ones are just little things like you can just catch these people lying to you all the time. The one time I really, really lost it and went kind of slightly thick of it style, I made sure that it was to a civil servant who was also called James and who was a little bit posh. But it was, I won't give their full name, but I said, have you invited these MPs to this event that's happening? And they said yes. And then they hadn't. And I caught them. By that point, it was too late. It would have been, offensive to to invite them, and they say, "Yeah, you got me." And I had no ability to reprimand this person. The only way you could have got rid of them was promoting them somewhere else. It's a tiny little issue, but it was the one that I remember distinctly completely losing it because it was so easy for me to tell. I just called up the MPs. Have you been invited to this event? No. Right, okay. And who was invited instead? Obviously other civil servants, right? They're little bits like that. Something much bigger. When we were in the Treasury, like every other Chancellor before, the Chancellor was invited to get rid of the winter fuel payments. Now, I can see the economic reason for this, absolutely. The fact that it seems like a bit of a bung to older people, the fact that it's not means tested, the fact that there is a separate means tested hardship fund for older people who can't pay for winter fuel. See, all perfectly logical. But politically, it's obviously a toxic thing, as Labour are discovering. And this was shelved by us as it was shelved by every other Chancellor before and since. Until Labour come along, they're so bereft of ideas themselves that they turn to the civil service and they get offered up on a plate straight away this idea that the Treasury has always wanted to do and that is obviously, again, politically toxic. So that might not be the worst example in terms of actual policy, unless, of course, you're concerned about old people freezing to death over winter. But it shows, again, that no matter which colour of party is in, you've got the blob offering up the same sorts of things. And you can go more extreme in terms of the way that Liz Truss believes, I think with some credibility, that there was a kind of concerted effort to completely undermine her, not just in the civil service, but Bank of England and other things like that. I'm not hugely expert on those bits, but she certainly seems to think so. And just the fact that, let's take it over the last 50 years or so, from the 1974 elections, every single party that won pledged to reduce immigration. Every single time, including the Labour ones. And what's happened? Every single time it's gone up, completely against the will of what the people actually wanted. And why is that? Well, it's a mixture of the fact that all the civil servants think it's good and all the instruments and institutions that they have are geared towards thinking that it's good. The Office for Budget Responsibility, set up by George Osborne in 2010 or so, it was supposed to stop budget irresponsibility. Well, look what's happened to debt and deficit spending since then. It's got much worse. It's so rigid in the OBR that it will score immigration highly, and that might be about to change, but it wouldn't score other new things coming along that democratically elected ministers wanted to do. Steve Barclay was, I think, an excellent health secretary, and he wanted to get loads of digital and data and new tech things inside the health service, things like the Ozempic weight loss jabs, and was only able to get the funding for a very small pilot of that, rather than a much wider rollout he wanted, because the OBR said they wouldn't score it positively, but they would score positively some more immigration to help the NHS. So you've got democratic will being thwarted by the institutions as set up like this. And then again, just look at the ECHR. This kind of phenomenon of the blob is not limited purely to the UK. It happens in Europe, it happens in America as well. And the scariest thing for me is that it was all predicted by a guy called James Burnham in a book called The Managerial Revolution in 1941. And you read it today and it feels as fresh as ever. And this guy was clocking this happening, I suppose, after 8 years or so of FDR completely transforming the American government in the midst of World War II going on. You could see that the managers and the bureaucrats and the technocrats were all coming and slowly taking over. And that has only ever continued in one ratcheting direction.
Yeah, and one way that phenomenon has been described recently, I mean, you mentioned Liz Truss there, is the deep state. Do you think that's an accurate way of characterising it?
Yes and no. I mean, obviously, the American elections have brought this up in the way that Trumpian MAGA people have talked about it. It's perhaps not entirely useful to try and get the sorts of people agreeing with the need to change this that we might need. But the other bit I should say is with the deep state, that sometimes this is used to refer to the sort of the intelligence services and the sort of quasi-intelligence services bits inside there. Actually, I've my very, very limited experience with them, and if it was wider, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you anyway, but that they're one of the few bits of the system that work really well, right? That they actually have got a real sense of duty. It literally is life and death, and the stuff that they'll do that we'll never know and be able to thank them for is incredible. And so it seems a pity to get those bits where it's sort of fair enough that it's quite clandestine and that the Home Secretary knows a bit and the Prime Minister knows a chunk, but no one really knows operatively who we've got stationed in what countries and under what disguises and things is fair enough. But it's the fact that there's so much of the civil service The departments are huge by head count, they're huge by sprawl of the buildings and where they're all located and things like that. And trying to find, and also then out into the NGOs and the quangos, which I think is the most egregious bit, these sorts of executive bodies that are not run by directly elected people. That is the real problem, where all this stuff kind of fritters away. And there are little bits, to go a bit inside baseball, inside, for example, the Cabinet Office. The worst group that I never had time to kind of get my head around and wrangle properly was called the EDS, the Economic and Domestic Secretariat. It sounds incredibly Byzantine or Politburo-esque, doesn't it? This was a group that sort of shadowed all the work of all the other bits of all the departments, but didn't report to the wonderfully anachronistic Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, which is the title given to the Cabinet Minister who runs the Cabinet Office, sort of think of it like the Chief Operating Officer of the government, just reported to the Cabinet Secretary instead. So totally bypassed the democratically elected people and clashed up against various other bits of the state as well. And when the democratically elected people would try and go a bit faster than the civil service wanted, and so under Boris there was a Prime Minister's delivery team led by an amazing woman called Emily Lawson, who was from the private sector and was drafted in to help on vaccines and then on wider delivery. They would use, shock horror, live data to try and understand what was going on. And we were going to try and roll out live data tables. So everybody was, from all the different departments in the centre, was singing off the same hymn sheets, right? Very radical, very much resisted by all the other departments, obviously. But this EDS people would come along and they'd take screenshots of the live data. And then a few weeks later, that would be copy and pasted into a PowerPoint presentation that would then be used to inform the people who were actually making decisions, the junior officials, by which time it was all obviously completely out of date. Right? It was completely ludicrous. And this is because these people had never even done an entry graduate course at a Deloitte or a McKinsey or something, right? So this is the kind of problem. And I never had any ability, operational authority to go and try and look at any of this kind of stuff properly. And there are how many people in the Cabinet Office? 10,000 up against a couple of special advisors and a couple of ministers. So it's just impossible to get to grips with this if you don't have a plan going into government in the first place, which is why I think it's so important that the Conservative Party, with its scars on its backs on this, or the Reform Party, who at least haven't got the kind of negative baggage with them, are working on changing a lot of this from day one.
And I mean, so you say that that's very important. They need to have a plan going in. What should be the key planks of that plan?
I think you've got to have basically legislation on a whole host of things drafted and ready to be implemented on day one. I think you've got to probably, I'm afraid, fire a load of senior civil servants because they will just otherwise resist to have a kind of loss aversion, which is understandable on a human level. But was the old joke about science that it advances one funeral at a time? There's going to be, I'm afraid, a bit of, not obviously not literally in this case, but these people need to be moved. And Truss, again, they got rid of the permanent secretary from the Treasury, but left all of his lieutenants and everybody else in charge. And all you did was make them angry. The old, the start of chapter 3 in The Prince, Machiavelli says, if you're going to go for a snake, you make sure you kill it, right? Or leave it alone. Because if you wound it, that thing is going to come back for you. And that's exactly what happened to Kwarteng and to Truss. So what you need to do, I think, is to have a whole repeal of various bits of legislation that give this power away, fritter these powers away. You need to have somebody in the Treasury who is willing to stop the checks to all these various quangos, to abolish all of them on day one, and to have whatever legislative vehicles are required to get the power and responsibilities from all these quangos, I think almost all of them, in fact, back under ministerial decree. And for the regulators, I would have a deal with the Speaker in the House of Commons and the Lord Speaker in the House of Lords to have there be committees either not just over the departments themselves, but perhaps instead or as well as the various regulators. And so Parliament would be scrutinising the work of those regulators much, much more closely. I think you also need to have probably all the senior civil servants. So you have the way it works, you've got the kind of permanent secretary tier here. You've got the directors general there, and then directors, deputy directors, and then it goes weirdly grade 6, that's what they're called, grade 7, and then more junior roles below that. I think at least all the directors general need to be politically appointed, and you need a lot more special advisors in there as well to help do some of that advice and policy formation. So I think those are the kind of first day one things you would need to do. And you also just need members of Parliament to be elected for whom it won't be the best job they ever do, so they're not desperate to cling onto it, and who are high quality people who are used to running things or scrutinizing things in other walks of life. And we've also had a problem with that. And this is what civil servants will say to you, is that, look, we've had crap ministers for so long in so many areas that we've had to step up and do it because you're all so bad. And there is also some truth in that. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. But I think that if you put power back in the hands of ministers properly, you will attract higher quality people who will not be so frustrated compared to the way they can act with swiftness in their private sector lives. You'll get quality people coming in, or at the very least, you will see people being found out very quickly. And you know, a small example of this, give credit, Wes Streeting, the Labour Health Secretary, abolishing NHS England. No one can tell you what on earth that does. And yeah, you know what? He might not have it to hide behind anymore. But frankly, NHS England weren't doing their fair share of taking blame for things anyway. And the public don't care. They just see, right, you're Health Secretary, you're in charge of the NHS. Why is everything so rubbish? So it's high risk for Streeting, but at least he will now have a lot more of those metaphorical levers to pull and will be able to sink or swim based on his own ideas, his own exertions, and his own ability to actually get things done at an operational level. We should see that spread right across the system.
And so in terms of how this is pitched to the electorate and approached politically, one of the questions I've been asking a couple of times on this podcast, which I've actually had different answers to, is how should you bill it? So, should it be we're going to go after the unelected blob, we're going to gut the quangos and sort of make that central to your pitch? Or should it be more softly, so the blob doesn't really know what's coming and then suddenly you arrive in power and clobber it over the head with these reforms that you've been suggesting in a way it doesn't necessarily expect?
It's a great question. I suppose that a slight cop-out is that with modern campaigning techniques, you should be able to do a bit of both, right? You know, one size doesn't fit all anymore. And for people who are already radicalized, you can do the blob smashing chat. And for the other chattering classes, you've just got to say, well, no, this is fine. It's all about accountability. And it's about, just philosophically speaking, there's a long, proud tradition of doing this. So we just want to hold these people to account properly. And there is a long, proud tradition of that, right? You know, we get taught in schools that it's all kind of Hobbes and Locke and these things. But there is a deeper tradition of people who are often counted as more like jurists, but who have been really instrumental to implementing these sorts of changes from common law into these things, and the kind of William Blackstones and John Seldons and Matthew Hales, John Fortescue's, all of those sorts of people that Burke draws on to have this kind of not just a sort of argy-bargy rhetoric that I think is so important to keeping accountability up and to allowing course correction and things like that, but you can say there is a proud tradition and a much more legitimate legal tradition of this and of getting high quality people. So I think that's possibly the way that you do with the chattering classes. With other people, you can say, look at Doge over in America. They did an amazing job there of actually highlighting some of the maddest stuff. And I think it's no coincidence that they use a lot of that through Twitter, and you can get at people straight away, and that they went, first of all, for some of the mad spending that was going on. You know, the transgender opera in Peru that was being funded and things like that. But, you know, that is, I think I worked it out, that it's about 2 American average families worth of tax for the year going on the transgender opera. And there was another transgender comic book, I think, in another South American country. Little silly things like that don't obviously touch the sides of spending, but that get people people at home are smart enough to know that huge amounts of stuff is being wasted. And when you just flood the zone with so many mad ideas of what's happening, and how many people have power, way more money than the Prime Minister and way more power than almost everybody other than the Prime Minister, and you don't know their names. And so I think that the nice bit would be, not only would you put these people in and be directly accountable, but they would be able to have a public persona and forced to have a public persona they currently don't. At the moment, they get to hide behind the minister, who is merely the sort of spokesman. But again, you look at America, senior people in the administration are allowed and encouraged to go out and talk on the media about their area of expertise. This guy, Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy in the White House, is just an amazing brain, right? He's just totally focused on this one policy area that he's been doing forever, and he goes out and defends it himself, which I think is great. Or David Sachs, the kind of AI guy, is allowed to go on podcasts and things and explain what the administration is doing and being challenged on that, rather than having a minister who frankly wouldn't know the detail and is being kind of prepped on it in the few minutes before they go on air anyway. And so if we know their names, I think that would be a big part of it. And the other thing you then do, as well as having to cut lots of jobs, I think you pay these people a hell of a lot more. And whilst that might upset some people, I think for the kind of chattering classes that you're worrying about, Laurie, I think you go, look, see, we really value the civil service and we really value their level of skill and expertise and all the rest of it. Because the alternative, as everyone will really know, is that if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys, right?
Yes, well, I don't know if I was aiming to be the spokesman for the chattering classes, but I guess I was for a second there. But I would be interested to go back into your thoughts of kind of what the blob actually is and delineating that. So obviously, the blob can roughly mean the institutional inertia that means that nothing gets done in government. But obviously, we've mostly talking about Whitehall and the civil service here. But there is also the related thing of the quangocracy and of institutions like the Climate Change Committee and others. Now, obviously, those are different things, but they are related. How would you differentiate the two?
I don't know if I would, to be honest. Look, the Blessed Margaret, a woman for whom I have, nothing but undying love, and were she to be resurrected, I would, fight and die for her in an instant. I think the one thing that Mrs. Thatcher got wrong was creating a lot of these quangos, and it was decent enough logic. She thought that if you got these people and these powers and things out of central Whitehall departments, out of Westminster, they wouldn't be infected by the same kind of statist brain rot. And she was wrong in that. Maybe she was right to start with, because when creating them, you got some power over appointments. But it's the same sort of people that go into those things. And the civil servants whose idea it is of getting some outside experience often is going and working in one of these executive agencies, which, by the way, are often housed in the same buildings that the central departments are in, right? So you're not exactly ever leaving. You walk into the same door. It's just with a slightly different coloured lanyard on. And so I wouldn't differentiate them. The same sorts of people want to go into them, the same rules about governing public life, the same rubbish pay, the same great job security and pension to counteract the rubbish pay. It all attracts the same sorts of people. And that's why I just want to do away with all of them and have the responsibility going back with the ministers. And the reason that I think that they're so iniquitous at heart is that they... the kind of tired cliche that someone with a hammer, everything is a nail. If you're the Climate Change Committee, you're worried about climate change, right? The clue's in the name, does what it says in the tin. But if you're the energy minister or the DEFRA minister, you've also got to keep the lights on. You've also got to keep the horses safe and the sheep fed. You've also got to keep the water from going off. You've got to keep all these different things, and you have to balance this stuff. And again, another cliche that's there for a reason: to govern is to choose. It is not ever the case, unlike what some mad academics will say, that you can get a right answer that you get just by being the smart expert. It doesn't work like that. And I do some academic work at the moment, and I'm reading some completely batty stuff from some so-say smart people who, in the Simpsons joke, they say the quiet part out loud. And they say what you need to have is epistemic cognitive political authority, aka you need to be a smart person like me with my PhD, right? And then we'll all get together in a small group of us and we'll make the right decisions. When you ask them how they choose the experts, they can never tell you. They can't work that bit out. When you ask them what counts as an emergency, they can't tell you that either. It'll be climate change, it'll be abortion, it'll be... There's all the sorts of... Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but it'll be those sorts of things that matter, but not immigration, and not the debt crisis piling up, and not the epidemic of kids stabbing each other in London. Those won't count because they're low status ideas. So these people who try and say that they're arguing from first principles and would be the enlightened ones and all the rest of it are really just following every Guardian headline. And that's why what you need at the end of the day is someone with democratic legitimacy to kind of follow the kind of the general will, who will be there to be accountable at a certain point for the decisions they made and for balancing things off one against the other. There's a woman, I think Fabienne Peter, who's written a book about legitimacy, saying that actually, this is this epistemic, which just means knowledge, right? Epistemic cognitive political authority. Boris Johnson didn't have that, and it should all just have been experts because lockdown was a complete consensus idea, she says, and only Sweden did it wrong. And Sweden killed loads more people, right? All you've got to do is one quick Google search, say that isn't actually right. Okay, more deaths early on, but it all kind of balanced out afterwards. And then you didn't have in Sweden, the kind of ghost children, you didn't have all the debt problem, all these other bits and bobs in quite the same way. And you need people to be able to look at all those decisions in the round. That's what a politician is fundamentally there for, and to justify their actions at a certain point at the ballot box in the future. That is the best way to get good government, not just because it seems like it's accountable. And when you have all these quangos, you do not have that because they only care about their one little bailiwick.
Yes, absolutely. So we're coming up on time a bit here, but you mentioned the quangocracy and the civil service are more or less two heads of the same hydra. But another thing there is the ECHR, of course, and in general, over the past 25 years or so, we've seen these Blairite reforms, and we've seen really the lawyers coming out and the judiciary coming out and trying to really, even though it's very alien to our constitution, to stamp its almost political authority on our politics and be more activist. How should a reforming government hope to deal with this constitutional outgrowth?
Yeah, you're bang on, right? And I was sat. We're recording this just after Eurovision. I sat watching some of the results come in with my American wife, and she was looking, just completely bizarre at some of the acts and some of the people who report the country's votes. And I looked at her and I said, "This is why we had Brexit, right? We're just fundamentally, temperamentally, and in all sorts of ways very different from these sorts of people who clearly need a lot more rules to not do mad stuff than we do." And the maddest version of all, the ECHR stuff came around because the breakdown in the rule of law and civilization that happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. It was never meant for us to need this stuff because we've always had ancient liberties and jury trials and freedom and under the law and all these things on this island. And a very wonderful, proud tradition has grown out of it that has spread to the US and the rest of the Anglosphere as well. It's very different than on the continent. And that's why I think fundamentally we voted to leave the EU, because people just kind of felt that it was wrong and unnecessary. So we found out from leaving the EU that we didn't also leave the ECHR and all this other stuff, and how difficult a fight that will be. Oh, you'll be getting rid of our human rights, as if there were never any human rights until Tony Blair came along, right? Obviously cobblers on its face. And yet what's happened, exactly as you say, is that this stuff has been threaded through domestic statute, domestic law. The worst example, the Human Rights Act, 1998, that enshrines some of these things that so many of these mad activist judges are now leaning on, saying that's why you can't deport the chicken nuggets guy. That's why you can't deport the Caribbean lady whose Latvian husband wouldn't like the spicy food back in the West Indies. Just mad stuff that we've all seen and heard about. That is another part of the work that is being done by a couple of decent think tanks and needs to be done by a lot more, and by the sort of small r reforming parties who ever come in at the next election. This is the kind of stuff. And again, you need to do it all in one go. Amazing people like Rupert Lowe talk about the kind of Great Repeal Act. A lot of this stuff needs to be completely affuered out. And part of the problem, of course, we've now had like 25 years or so of case law being built up leaning on this stuff. And so you need a lot of smart jurists going through and sort of disapplying some of these precedents as a kind of fundamental aberration of the same sort that we've seen in the kind of political sphere as well. And the nice thing I think about this is that it doesn't need to be a party political issue. Obviously, Reform will be very in favour of this. The Conservative Party, having failed to do quite a lot because of these problems, are in favour of it. But you've got great Labour figures who are in favour of this as well. I think Richard Johnson, the academic, is better on this than almost anybody, and kind of wrote something for Policy Exchange about going back to a kind of political constitution. People like Jonathan Sumption obviously being in favour of this as well. And Labour, frankly, are getting this a bit more quickly in some areas than the Tories ever did. I mentioned West Streeting. You've got Starmer complaining about the OBR recently before the liaison committee meeting that he was at. And Dominic Cummings, in the same way that instead of Trump, they have to put Donald Trump everywhere through his briefings so he keeps interest. Dominic Cummings mentions the Downing Street Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, in every single blog. Right? And that's the guy who knows, oh my God, I'm not getting anything done here because the system's so messed up. So I think it can be a bipartisan or a non-partisan issue, and we can go back to arguing about actual policies rather than the structure of how you get any of this stuff done. But if we don't do it, we're completely snookered in all kinds of ways. So I think that it's getting pretty existential because the challenges that we are building up and not dealing with are getting worse and worse, whether that's climate change legislation or net zero, whether it's mass immigration, whether it's frankly just the general understanding out there that politics has sort of lost its ability to heal itself. And you get people like David Betts, a kind of very respected academic, starting to say that civil war is coming. It's just terrifying to think about, right? And all of this is because of bad governance. And the lovely thing, I guess, to try and end on a happy note, is that we can fix all of this stuff, right? It's all self-inflicted, which is really frustrating. But it's not like we're being invaded. It's not like there's a terrible blight of the harvest. It's not like the Huns are over the hill, any of this kind of stuff. This is all mind-forged manacles, and we can change it all with a few strokes of a pen. And we've seen when we had restorations in the past, whether the restoration of Charles II, whether it was, frankly, what happened in the 1980s. Britain can turn itself around really fast because we're a great people, a great nation with great traditions, and we still have it in us. As Tennyson said, though much is taken, much abides.
Indeed. Well, what a fantastic note to end on. James Price, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks so much, mate.
Now, we've had a very disappointing judgment in the Lucy Connolly appeal this week against her draconian 31-month sentence. She will remain in prison now until August. And earlier this week, I caught up with David Shipley to discuss that. This is a slightly different format for The Sceptic today, but I'm going to be talking about to David Shipley, who is a writer on prison reform and justice and things like this. And we're going to be talking about the Lucy Connolly case. And so her appeal, the judgment has just happened today, and it's been denied, her appeal. And that was, of course, against the 31-month sentence that she received for a intemperate tweet sent on the night of the Southport attack. David and I were both at the appeal on Thursday, and so we'll talk, I think, a bit about that first, probably, but and then just really go through the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, so David, well, obviously, well, I suppose even before that, I mean, it's very. We should note it's very heartbreaking for Lucy to still be in prison. I think that's.
I think for her family as well. You know, we both met with Ray, her husband, on Thursday, didn't we? And I think you can see how tough he is finding it. And I wrote about this today, and I said I think it's a profound injustice that she's in prison. She shouldn't be. But yeah, I feel heartbroken. I was gutted when I saw that news come through this morning.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.